bread scraped with the brown jelly from the bottom of the dripping bowl, a tiny Shippam's jar that fed 5 children at once, bananas dusted with sugar the first time they came back after the war. These were the whole meal, the whole memory. Here are 30 cheap British sandwiches no one makes anymore. Bread and dripping sat at the heart of working-class kitchens for most of the 20th century, and the version people remember is not the pale fat scraped from the top, it is the mucky fat. That dark, jellied sediment at the very bottom of the roasting tin, intensely savoury, is spread thick on a doorstep of white bread with a pinch of salt pressed in with your thumb. In Yorkshire and Lancashire households through the 1940s and the 50s, this was a treat, not a concession. Kids queued after school hoping the bottom of the tin had not been used yet. The colour told you whether it was beef or pork, and the depth of the dark layer told you how long that tin had been building. The fat nobody else wanted fed entire families through the post-war years when a roasting joint appeared once a week at most, and its dripping was carefully collected into the bowl, kept specifically for the purpose beside the hob. Today, that bowl sits at the back of very few kitchens, and the knowledge of what to do with what settles at its bottom has gone with the generation that kept it. The sugar butty arrived in children's lunchboxes, not as a joke, but as a genuine act of care, because during rationing there was nothing sweeter to put between bread. From the early 1940s until sugar rationing ended in 1953, chocolate was queued for on your points, biscuits were a luxury, and a sweet treat meant a thin scraping of butter on white bread and a pinch of sugar pressed hard enough to stick. The sugar would crunch and dissolve slowly, the butter giving just enough richness to feel like something rather than nothing. Some mothers used moist brown sugar, darker, more treacly, a completely different thing. Every variation was its own small act of kitchen improvisation. You stopped making them when the sweet shops filled up, when chocolate came back, when there was something better to put in the tin. Nobody decided to stop. There was just one day when nobody reached for the sugar, and then that was that. When bananas returned to Britain in 1946, after 6 wartime years of absence, the Ministry of Food released the first batch, and it went almost entirely to children who had never tasted one. Mothers who remembered them stood in queues, brought them home, and made what they had been dreaming of since the war started. They sliced the banana thin on buttered white bread, scattered it with white sugar crystals, the soft tropical sweetness against the crunch of undissolved sugar. In homes that had rationed everything for a decade, this felt like the war being truly over. Some households added a dash of single cream. Some toasted the bread. In the north, the tradition ran well into the 1960s. Mothers made it for their children the way it had been made for them when rationing finally released its grip. The banana and sugar sandwich never appeared in a cookbook. It was passed down in the act of making it, and it stopped when the people who had felt the particular joy of that first post-war taste were gone. Shippam's paste came in tiny glass jars, 2 ounces and 4 ounces, and a single jar fed a family of 5 if you spread it carefully enough. That was the point. In the years after rationing, when meat was expensive, and the corner shop had more varieties of paste than fresh protein, one small jar of salmon and shrimp or crab could produce a dozen sandwiches if the butter went on thick and the paste went on thin. You applied it with a knife rather than a spoon, drawing it across the bread in a single motion. Too much pressure tore the bread, too little, and it balled up. Nobody taught you this. You watched. By the time you were old enough to make sandwiches yourself, your hands knew the motion without instruction. Shippams of Chichester had been making pastes since 1750, and by the 1950s their salmon and shrimp meant packed lunches, tennis in the park, Summer. The jars are still there on some shelves. The hands that knew exactly how to use them are not. Corned beef. In its key opening tin was already a rationed staple before the 1940s ended, and by the time rationing lifted in 1954, most households had strong opinions about it. Some ate it cold, sliced against a smear of piccalilli on white bread, with the sharp vinegar cutting through the dense, salty beef in a combination that worked better than either alone. Others fried it until the outside crisped, then tucked it into bread with brown sauce. The opening ritual mattered, the small key soldered to the base, the strip of metal requiring a full wrist rotation, the lid peeling back. You always cut the block wrong the first time and lost a corner. Everyone did the first few times. The people who got it right every time, who knew exactly where to start the cut and how far to take it, had learned by watching, and they never once mentioned the watching. Potted beef sat in a ceramic basin on the kitchen shelf through the cold months, its surface sealed under clarified butter, and you cut into it to find something that smelled of slow cooking and mace and whatever tough cut of shin or brisket had gone in at the start of the week. It wasn't a delicacy. It was a way of stretching a pound of cheap beef into several days of sandwiches, school lunchboxes, and works canteen tins. Yorkshire kitchens were particularly associated with it through the 1930s and 40s, the tradition running through the mill towns of the West Riding. The recipe never needed writing down, because every woman who made it had learned by standing next to the woman who'd made it before her. The amount of salt, whether you added Marmite or nutmeg, was household tradition, not instruction. Some families used anchovies in theirs. Some didn't. You'd know which kind of kitchen you were in before you'd finished your first slice. Egg sandwiches in those kitchens were made with salad cream, not mayonnaise. Salad cream. In the 1950s in Britain, olive oil came in a tiny bottle from the chemist, used for earwax, not cooking. Mayonnaise barely existed as a household product. Heinz salad cream was what you had, sharp and vinegary, thinner than anything continental. It was mixed into roughly chopped hard-boiled eggs with salt and white pepper, sometimes with mustard cress snipped from the punnet on the windowsill. At WI meetings, crustless triangles on white, in-packed lunches, thick slices. The cress was almost always homegrown, a damp flannel on the windowsill, a week of waiting. The egg and salad cream sandwich has not entirely vanished, but the version made this way, with the specific tang of salad cream rather than the richer blankness of mayo, belongs to a palate shaped in the 1950s, and it is not being passed down. Tinned sardines were the coastal kitchen's answer to the dripping bowl, nutrient-dense and cheap, requiring nothing more than a fork to become a filling. Along the fishing communities of Cornwall and the East Anglian coast through the 1940s and the 1950s, the sardine sandwich was made by mashing sardines with their own oil, a chopped tomato, and a splash of Worcestershire sauce, then spread roughly on bread. The bread absorbed the oil within minutes, going faintly translucent at the edges, appetizing if you had grown up with it, off-putting if you had not. Inland families recoiled. Coastal families thought nothing of it. The sandwich carried the working harbour into the lunchbox in the most literal sense, oily, tangy, and deeply savoury. The children of those kitchens still connect the smell of tinned sardines with the walk to school, with their mother's hands, with the tin lid on the draining board. It vanished when they grew up and made different choices for their own children. Brawn required an entire afternoon, a large pot, and a willingness to engage with the full reality of where meat came from. A pig's head, sometimes just the collar, went into a pot with water, peppercorns, a bay leaf, and root vegetables, and bubbled on the hob until the meat pulled free of the bone without effort. Then came the stripping, hands working through the hot pile, separating meat from fat from cartilage, discarding nothing but bare bone. The result went into a ceramic basin, pressed under a weight for 24 hours in the larder, and turned out as a firm, sliceable loaf. Served cold with English mustard on brown bread, it was dense and gelatinous in a way that held the slice together, with flecks of darker meat distributed unevenly through it. Post-war working-class kitchens in the Midlands and the North made it as a matter of course. The recipe required no card because it required no measurements, just the knowledge of what to do at each stage, passed by watching, and gone from most families by the time the 1970s came round. Ox tongue was the Sunday cook's investment in the working week. A whole tongue, bought cheaply on Saturday because most customers walked past it, went into a pot with pickling spices and hours of barely simmering water. When it was tender, it came out still hot, and the rough outer skin peeled back to reveal pale, fine-grained meat, which got pressed into a loaf tin, chilled overnight, and emerged as a cold, firm, sliceable cylinder. Cut thin across the grain. The grain ran in only one direction. Your grandmother knew that, and you learned by watching. Laid on white bread with English mustard, it had a clean, slightly mineral flavour that nothing else replicated. She knew it was done when a skewer passed through without resistance. She didn't time it. She checked it. When the woman who ran that Sunday process stopped, nobody in the household knew where to begin. It stopped when she did. The lard sandwich was sometimes hardship, the raw wartime kind, when there was genuinely nothing else in the house. Lard scraped cold from the bowl, waxy and white on white bread, with salt pressed into the surface. During rationing in the 1940s, lard remained available when butter and margarine had run out, and in the poorest urban households, it was a default rather than a choice. But not every lard sandwich came from that place. Some households kept making them long after rationing ended because the children had grown up with the salt and the fat and the soft bread and couldn't see why they should want anything different. There is a distinction between making do and making something good from what you have, and the families who made lard sandwiches without shame understood it instinctively. What they carried to the factory gate wasn't an apology. It was lunch. Fried liver and bacon between two thick slices of bread, smeared with brown sauce before the filling went in. This was the northern working man's breakfast sandwich, eaten at the kitchen table at 6:30, or carried wrapped in paper to the factory gate. Ox liver was the cheapest offal available, bought for pennies at the end of the butcher's day, sliced thin enough to cook through in 2 minutes in a hot, dry pan, the outside going dark and just crisp, while the inside stayed barely pink. A rasher of back bacon went in alongside it, the fat rendering out and basting the liver as both cooked. The smell, intensely mineral, smoky, sharpened by the hot fat, filled the kitchen the way very few cooking smells do, the kind that comes back 30 years later and puts you immediately at that table, at that hour, watching those hands at the pan. The liver was done when it stopped being soft to the press of a finger, but before it went rubbery. The only way to know that moment was to have stood there enough times to feel it yourself. The mucky, fat and raw onion sandwich was a step beyond plain bread and dripping. Where the pale upper layer meant ordinary dripping, mucky fat meant the dark jellied sediment at the very bottom of the roasting bowl, the intensified extract of every joint that had passed through the kitchen in recent weeks. It was spread thick, then topped with raw white onions sliced thin enough to be translucent. The bite hit in sequence, sharp raw onion first, then the deep mineral savouriness of the fat, and finally the bread absorbing everything and holding it together. In the pit villages of Yorkshire and the mining towns of the Midlands through the 1940s and 50s, this was end-of-week food, Friday evening food. Nobody makes it now. It requires a culture of nothing wasted, a bowl kept beside the hob, and a taste that most modern palates would need time to find again. Potted shrimps on bread were a Lancashire coast tradition long before anyone called them a delicacy. The tiny brown shrimps of Morecambe Bay, smaller and sweeter than any prawn, were caught in cockling boats and sold by women walking the streets of Fleetwood and Morecambe. They went into a pot with clarified butter, mace, cayenne, and a pinch of nutmeg, and the whole thing set as the butter cooled. You spread it cold on white bread, the spiced butter softening just enough under your knife to smear without tearing. The briny sweetness of those specific shrimps in that specific butter carried a flavour as particular to its geography as any cheese is to its region. Morecambe Bay potted shrimps still exist, protected by a regional designation. But spreading them cold on plain bread at home, as an ordinary lunchtime thing rather than a restaurant starter, has slipped away with the households that knew no other way to eat them. Not every British sandwich of the era deserves reverence, and none attracted more affectionate national contempt than the British rail version. When the railways nationalised in 1947, platform refreshment rooms across the country began selling triangular white bread sandwiches stored under glass domes all day, corners curling as the hours passed, the bread hardening by degrees. Historian Keith Lovegrove described those upturned corners as resembling the pages of a well-thumbed paperback. 8 million sold every year, which says less about quality than about the total absence of alternatives. The fillings were few. The debates about which was worst ran for decades. You ate one not because you wanted to, but because the train had been delayed and you'd been at Crewe since 7:30. Prue Leith joined the board in 1980 and improved things considerably. By then, the damage to the national memory was permanent. During the war years, the Ministry of Food produced a series of pamphlets encouraging housewives to use whatever was growing on the allotment, and grated raw carrot appeared in enough of them to suggest someone in Whitehall had decided it was the answer to everything. The carrot sandwich was exactly what it sounds like: grated carrot on buttered bread, sometimes with a little malt vinegar stirred through, sometimes with nothing but salt. In households where rationing had stripped the cupboard bare, you took the ministry's suggestions seriously. The carrot provided sweetness and crunch for almost no cost. No cooking, 2 minutes to assemble. The ministry also promoted carrots as improving night vision, which was, it later emerged, propaganda cover for the development of radar. Their credibility survived this. The carrot sandwich, in the piece that followed, largely did not. Gentleman's relish was not a poor man's filling. Patum peperium was created in 1828 and sold in small ceramic pots at prices that placed it firmly in upper-class pantries. But it appeared across class lines more often than its reputation suggested, because a tiny amount went an extraordinary distance. The anchovy paste was intensely salty, deeply savoury, announcing itself before you had opened the pot, and it was applied in a single thin layer with the tip of a knife. Too much, and it was genuinely inedible. The right amount was a matter of calibration that you either already knew or you did not, and knowing it marked you as someone who had grown up around the stuff. The recipe has been kept secret since 1828. The manufacturer still exists, but the reflex, reaching for that small ceramic pot and applying it with the instinctive economy of someone who had done it 100 times, belongs to a kind of household that is running out of people. Condensed milk on bread was the northern butty tradition that nobody outside those kitchens quite believed until they tried it. A tin of Nestlé sweetened condensed milk, thick, intensely sweet, faintly caramelized, was spread directly onto white bread, sometimes with butter underneath, sometimes without. In working-class households across Lancashire and Yorkshire from the 1930s onward, this was little one's food. The after-school sandwich, the packed lunch treat, the thing handed out when there was nothing else sweet in the house. The same tin went into the tea, thinned with hot water when fresh milk had run out. She'd pry the lid back with a spoon. It was stiff, and required a particular twist of the wrist. She'd pour a measure into each mug, then spread what was left onto bread. The tin is still sold. The hands that did both things at once, the tea and the bread, the same afternoon in the same kitchen. Those hands are gone now. Marmite and butter on white bread crossed every line that British kitchen culture drew, from the grand houses where it appeared on toast at breakfast, to the terraced rows where a thin scraping on a slice of bread was sometimes the entirety of a child's tea. Marmite was first produced in Burton-on-Trent in 1902, a byproduct of the Bass brewery's surplus yeast, and during both World Wars it was included in ration packs for its B vitamins. The Wartime Ministry of Food promoted it as a nutritional essential. In households where protein was scarce, the sandwich it made wasn't a luxury. It was the meal. The brown glass jar with its yellow lid became one of the most recognizable objects in the British kitchen. You either reached for it, or you didn't. There was no middle ground. The jar still exists. The person who always made sure it was in the cupboard does not. Before Marmite, before the wartime improvisations, before almost any of it, there was bloater paste. It came in a ceramic pot sealed with wax, and it smelled like nothing else in the kitchen. Bloater paste was made from whole herring caught at Great Yarmouth, shipped in wooden barrels to Sainsbury's Blackfriars kitchens from the 1890s onward, boned by hand, cooked with anchovies and spices in a formula kept so closely guarded it was never written anywhere the general staff could read, and left to mature for 2 to 3 months before being ladled into 2-ounce pots sealed with foil. It was intensely smoky, savoury in the way that fermented things are savoury, present in a way that lingered long after you had put the pot down. The generation that grew up with it thought nothing of the smell. The generation that did not decline to acquire the taste. Sainsbury's discontinued production after the Second World War. The ceramic pots remained in kitchen drawers for years after the last batch was gone. Bone marrow on bread was a working-class staple older than almost anything else in the British kitchen. You asked the butcher for the marrow bones, which cost almost nothing because most customers wanted nothing to do with them. At home, the bones went into the oven for 20 minutes at a medium heat, and the marrow, creamy, wobbly, intensely rich, was scooped out with a narrow spoon and spread onto bread while still warm, where it melted slightly into the crumb. Salt was the only seasoning it needed. Some cooks added horseradish. The knowledge of which bones to ask for, how long to roast them, and when to scoop was the kind of knowledge that lived in the butcher's own kitchen, learned by watching from a young age and never written down. That knowledge went quiet in most households by the 1960s. It barely makes a sound now. Spam arrived as a wartime import, processed pork and potato starch in a rectangular tin, courtesy of the American Lend-Lease program, and it stayed because a generation of households had learned to cook with it and didn't want to stop. Cold from the tin, sliced thick against a smear of piccalilli on white bread, it gave households something rationing had made rare, dense, protein-rich, satisfying without needing to be cooked. Some fried it until the outside crisped and the edges caramelized, then added English mustard. The piccalilli pairing was specifically British, the sharp, turmeric yellow pickle cutting through Spam's dense saltiness in a way neither achieved alone. Spam sandwiches peaked in the late 1940s and early 50s, carried in tins to factory floors and building sites. By the 1970s, they had become gentle self-deprecation, the sandwich you admitted to with a rueful smile. The smile and the combination have both gone now. Heinz sandwich spread appeared in lunchboxes sometime in the 1960s and stayed there, unquestioned, through the 70s and into the early 80s, bright yellow, slightly sweet, slightly tart, filled with tiny pieces of pickled cauliflower, gherkin, onion, and red pepper suspended in a thick mayonnaise base. You spread it on white bread right to the edges, which mattered more than it sounds because sandwich spread had a way of pooling in the center and leaving the corners bare if you did not commit to the motion. Some households ate it alone. Some paired it with a slice of cheese. In both cases, the result was soft, mildly tangy, and tasting of preservation rather than any individual ingredient. The kids who grew up eating it remember it with a fondness entirely out of proportion to its culinary merit. It is still on shelves. It tastes exactly the same. But the sandwiches it made in those specific kitchens with that specific bread in those years somehow do not taste the same now. Grated cheddar and raw onion was the working man's pub sandwich long before the pub served anything that aspired to occasion. Mature cheddar grated directly onto buttered white bread, topped with raw white onion, no pickle, no chutney, nothing that softened or polished it. The cheddar had to be strong. Mild cheddar made the whole thing pointless. The onion had to be raw. What made it work was two sharp things going in the same direction: the bite of the onion and the bite of a proper farmhouse cheddar meeting in the bread and producing something more direct than either alone. In the working men's clubs of the Midlands and the North through the 1960s and 70s, this was the bar snack, the thing you ordered when the alternative was nothing, plain, unashamed, built for appetite rather than occasion. The kind of sandwich that requires no explanation to people who grew up near it, and no amount of explanation to those who didn't. If the cheese and onion was about presence and appetite, what follows is about absence. Liver sausage was the default filling in sandwich bars across Britain through the 1960s and the early 70s. A photographer in 1972 captured a Whitehall bar with unrefrigerated slabs of it stacked on a shelf, edges already curling, and nobody in the image looked concerned because this was simply how lunch worked. Smooth and spreadable, made from finely ground pork liver and fat, it went on white bread with brown sauce and nothing more, the richness balanced by the vinegar and the bread. The works canteen served it. The school tuck shop sold it. Every railway refreshment room contained some version of it. Today it sits on supermarket shelves in a diminished form that most people walk past without stopping. The person who made it for you every day without once asking if you wanted it, the person who simply knew, stopped making it a long time ago, and no shelf has replaced that. Homemade potted meat was not the tinned variety, and anyone who grew up with the homemade version knew it before the second bite. Where the tin was smooth and uniform, the homemade was rougher, leftover cooked meat minced or pounded with butter, salt, mace, packed tight into a small basin, and stored cold under a skin of clarified butter. Every kitchen's version tasted of that kitchen, the specific seasoning, the ratio of meat to butter the woman making it had settled on over years. You spread it on white bread, and the flavor was concentrated in a way no tin could replicate, because that kind of concentration requires a particular kind of knowing. The recipe lived in her hands, not on any card. When she stopped making it, it stopped existing. Not the idea, but the actual thing, with that taste, from that kitchen. Beetroot and salad cream was the sandwich that announced itself before you'd taken a bite. The deep purple of the sliced beetroot bled immediately into the bread and the salad cream, staining everything in range. Fingers, plate, the tea towel you reached for, in a pink that required serious effort to shift. Mothers knew this and made it anyway, because the combination worked. The sweet, earthy beetroot against the sharp, vinegary cream produced something bracing and particular. In school lunchboxes through the 1960s and the 1970s, the beetroot sometimes leaked through the bread entirely, turning everything in the tin a uniform shade of pink. Kids complained. Mothers made it again the following week. A jar of pickled beetroot from the co-op, a squeeze of salad cream, 2 slices of white bread. No skill required, no preparation. The simple truth was the point. The staining was the price. Neither was ever quite enough to make anyone stop. Tinned salmon on crustless white bread with thin sliced cucumber was spread gently, without fuss. On the shelves of the corner shop through the 1950s, tins of pink salmon were slightly more expensive than sardines, but more presentable. Mild, pale, flaked with a fork and mixed with salad cream, layered over cucumber sliced nearly translucent. At church teas and summer garden parties, this went on the white plates alongside the egg and cress, made that morning and kept under a damp tea towel. Farmed salmon only became widely affordable in the late 1960s. Before that, tinned pink salmon from Canadian and Alaskan waters was the salmon most households knew. The crustless triangles belonged to occasions. The version made for yourself on a weekday, crusts left on, eaten standing at the counter, that one belonged to her entirely. It has no equivalent now. Golden syrup on buttered white bread was the sweet butty that needed no occasion, just a moment of hunger and the green Lyle's tin in the back of the cupboard. You used a spoon rather than a knife, spreading it thick enough that the syrup pooled at the edges and ran slightly when the bread was lifted, which was part of it rather than a problem. In Lancashire and Yorkshire through the 1950s and the 1960s, it was children's food, after-school food, the thing you were given when the biscuit tin was empty and tea was still an hour off. The tin, the distinctive design with the lion and the bees and Samson's riddle, lasted for weeks because a little went a long way. Some households used it on porridge, some on bread and butter pudding, but the syrup butty, eating cold, standing at the kitchen counter with the tin still open on the side, that was a specific comfort, belonging to a specific childhood that is now at a considerable distance. The jam butty. That is where it ends. 2 slices of white bread, a thick spreading of strawberry jam, butter underneath, if you'd been taught to put it there. In working-class Britain from the 1920s through the 1980s, the jam butty was the sandwich that existed at the edges of everything, handed to children who were hungry between meals, eaten standing at the counter while the main thing was still cooking, the thing that required no thought and no preparation, and nothing more than the knowledge that it was what was needed. There was no recipe. You knew how to make it before you were old enough to know you knew. The bread had to be soft, the jam had to be generous, the butter had to reach the corners. Everything else was noise. What made it irreplaceable was not the ingredients. It was the hand that made it, the particular way she held the knife, the thickness she considered correct, the kitchen it came from, the child who was waiting. The jam is still there, the bread is still there, the butter is still there. That kitchen is not, she is not, and somehow it never quite tastes the same. These kitchens have gone quiet. If one of them was yours, leave it in the comments. Somebody else is looking for it too.